More dramatic fallout from yesterday's Supreme Court ruling on the Voting Rights Act. Many on the left are outraged at the court's decision, which we're going to get into in a minute. But is that outrage justified?
I am deeply disappointed with the court's decision in this matter.
Today, the civil rights struggle for inclusion, the one big in America, has been dealt a severe blow.
This is a dark day for the Supreme Court.
Well, my voice was joined by throngs, millions of Americans who were frustrated, enormously disappointed.
This decision represents a serious setback for voting rights and has the potential to negatively affect millions of Americans across the country.
A Confederate decision that was made.
Confederate decision. Joining me now, Andy McCarthy. He's senior fellow at the National Review Institute and a contributing editor to National Review. Andy, a Confederate decision. I mean, you would think by listening to some of these that racism was given the stamp of approval officially by the Supreme Court yesterday. No. What actually happened?
No, what happened was the Supreme Court recognized that the institutional, systematic, race-based discrimination and disenfranchisement of voters that was the impetus for the Civil Rights Act, or for the Voting Rights Act in 1965, has long ago passed to the dustbin of history. And this particular provision, at the time it was enacted, was recognized by both the court and even the Congress that enacted it of being a very dubious constitutionality.
And what it said, the Voting Rights Act in a nutshell, was if you're a state with a long history of discriminations, back in '65, right, they used to require literacy tests of right. blacks and character tests. Right. They said then you can't change your voting rights laws unless you get pre-clearance from the Department of Justice and this court. Right. And that was necessary at the time, and there was no question about whether that was necessary at the time because of what was happening right. in a place like Mississippi and so on. But we are 40-plus years after that now, and there's right. a question about whether it's still necessary. And the High Court said, well, it needs to be evaluated differently. You can't just have blanket, all you 9 states have to go to DOJ first.
No, what people seem to have forgotten is that the way they did this in the first place was constitutionally very problematic. It was a bedrock assumption of states that entered the Union that, number one, their sovereignty by the federal government would be respected, and number two, they would be treated equally by the federal government. In order to remedy this profound evil, those two things were put on hold. But once the profound evil was remedied, the idea was that we were going to go back to square one. And that's why the actual normal in the country, which is right. states' rights and the feds not interfering with states' rights. Right, which is why when Congress enacted this in the first instance, they said 5 years. That's what they thought this would take. That was, well, you do the math. You do math better than I do.
No,
it's 1965.
No, I don't. We're
right?
both lawyers, so
right,
there's a reason we did that instead of medicine. Now, let me ask you about what we've seen here on the left. I mean, this outrage, because you have a great column up today, a National Review, that talks about how you believe the left that they are race-obsessed in their narrative, and that they need to perpetuate this narrative that this is racist and that this is the right trying to ignore the rights of blacks and others.
Right. This is a great success story. You'd have to be a progressive to hate this kind of progress. That's the only way that you could explain it. And the people who seem to hate it are the movement progressives and the race hucksters, because this is a moment, I think appropriately, that the Supreme Court took to recognize the achievement of American society in overcoming this form of institutional racism. And instead of celebrating it, the people who depend on this kind of demagoguery are screaming bloody murder, predictably.
You talk about how, in your column, that, for example, in Mississippi in 1965, the black registration rate was less than 7%, 70% for whites. In 2004, in Mississippi, the black registration rate was 76%, which is higher than the white registration rate, which is why the Supreme Court said it doesn't make sense to just carte blanche be subjecting Mississippi to Eric Holder and the DOJ before they try to mess with their Voting Rights Act.
Exactly right. And also what the court recognizes, and what I think the rest of us should recognize if we could put all this noise from the left aside, is what does it say about the American people? What the left is basically saying is, if this law is not on the books, the people in those states and in other states throughout the country want to have literacy tests back and want to have good character. Yeah, I mean, how crazy is that?
But the truth is, if they do it again, there are other remedies. It's not like your remedy list. You can sue. This isn't taking away your remedy. I want to get to this Minnesota State Rep Ryan Winkler, who comes out yesterday with this voting rights majority. This is his tweet. is 4 accomplices to race discrimination and 1 Uncle Thomas. Now he's tried to take it back, saying, if that was offensive, I apologize. Oh, and by the way, I didn't know what Uncle Thomas really meant.
Right. So what did he think it meant? That's the question. If he didn't mean it in a racially charged manner, what did he think he was saying? This guy went to Harvard, too.
Yes, right? He was a history major at Harvard, not to mention a J.D.
Did he not go to literature class?
Well, what he says is, I intended to point out the fact that Justice Thomas had turned his back on African-American civil rights. I didn't intend it as a racially derogatory term.
So I just meant he was a racist, not that he was a racist. I'm glad he clarified.
It's unbelievable how Justice Thomas really, he gets this every time he issues a decision that some on the left don't like when it comes to civil rights. Right. And it's not fair. Andy, thank you.
Thank you, Megan.
Well, the Senate is expected to